If you're watching this video, you're in the process of writing a blog post assignment for one of my classes. Now, the assignment asks you to pick an ethically tricky puzzle, find a philosophical tool that will help you solve the puzzle, and then use the philosophical tool to solve the puzzle. The assignment is relatively straightforward, and I've already emailed you a sample assignment from a previous student. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do in this video is offer a few tips for succeeding on the assignment. Now, the first thing you need to do is pick a good puzzle. Now, the biggest mistake that students make when working on this assignment when they're picking a puzzle is that they pick a puzzle with an obvious answer. Is Nestle wrong for using child slave labor in its chocolate supply chain? Yes, clearly. Was Bernie Madoff's massive Ponzi scheme evidence of virtuous character? No, of course not. Was it morally permissible for Harvey Weinstein's accusers to blow the whistle on his abusive behavior? Obviously. If the puzzle has an obvious answer, it won't make for a good paper for this particular assignment. Now, one thing you might wonder is what makes a puzzle obvious? My answer is what matters is whether you believe that it has an obvious answer. If I think that a puzzle has an obvious answer and you think that it's not obvious, then it works for the assignment. What I'm trying to avoid is a situation where your TA or I are reading your assignment and it's clear that you, the writer, think that the answer is obvious. Now, a second mistake that students make when working on this assignment is that they pick a puzzle that is best answered by another discipline. Will the COVID-19 vaccine allow us to reopen the country? I hope so, but that's a question for an infectious disease expert. What is the relationship between increased racial diversity within a marketing team and the team's productivity? I don't know. You need to ask an economist about that, etc. If your puzzle requires tools from a discipline outside of philosophy and not many tools from within philosophy, then it won't make for a good philosophy paper for this particular assignment. So here are some puzzles that are more likely to succeed. You find an example of sexual harassment in a workplace that doesn't fit into the standard paradigm, and you ask, is this sexual harassment? You find an example of an exploitative labor practice that workers nonetheless benefit from and consent to, and you ask, is this practice fair? The list goes on. So now let's talk about how to pick a philosophical tool. Now, the first thing to keep in mind when picking a philosophical tool is that you want to find a thought experiment or a theory. Now, for what it's worth, my experience has been that the most effective submissions for this assignment use thought experiments. So we'll begin by talking about how to use thought experiments. Now, two examples that come to mind are Chris Myers' thought experiment of Jason and Carol in the desert, and Peter Singer's thought experiment from Famine, Affluence, and Morality with the drowning child. Now, these are excellent thought experiments to use because they can be adapted to many different scenarios. For example, suppose you are talking about workers in poultry slaughterhouses in the United States. Workers routinely come down with debilitating injuries that are untreated. They're denied bathroom breaks, and they're fired if they try to raise awareness about the conditions that they are facing. So you might want to ask, is it morally permissible to hire workers to work in such conditions like these if they are desperate for a job but are made better off by the job than they would otherwise be, and they consent to taking the job? You could argue that the fact that a worker benefits from a job and consents to taking the job is insufficient to demonstrate that it is permissible to offer such a job, because, as the thought experiment of Jason and Carol shows, you can wrong someone even if they benefit from your treatment of them and they consent to that treatment. Now, whichever thought experiment you use, you should make sure to give a full explanation of the thought experiment. Devote at least a paragraph to describing the story that takes place in the thought experiment. Then use at least a paragraph to describe what the implications of the thought experiment are. So, for example, you can wrong someone even if they benefit from and consent to your treatment of them. Now, in addition to using thought experiments, you can also use philosophical theories. So suppose you're wondering whether it is permissible to lie to customers if you are working in an industry where other companies routinely lie to customers. A great theory to use for this is Kantian deontology. In particular, you should use the formula of humanity formulation of the categorical imperative, which goes like this. Treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, never merely as a means only, but always as an end in itself. If you present this principle, you should make sure to distinguish between treating someone as a means and treating someone merely as a means. Spend at least a paragraph explaining this distinction and give an example. So what does that look like? Well, one thing you could do is distinguish between buying a sandwich from someone and stealing a sandwich from them. So when you buy a sandwich from someone, you are using them as a means. They are a means of getting a sandwich, but you are also treating humanity as an end in itself by appealing to their rationality when you transparently, without any deception or fraud, trade money for the sandwich. When you steal a sandwich from them, on the other hand, you are using them merely as a means. You see them as no more than a source of sandwiches and are not treating them as a rational agent. So, after presenting your philosophical tool, there's one more thing you have to do for this assignment. You have to use the tool to solve your puzzle. And in my experience, successful blog post assignments do this through a two-step process. Step 1 is to redescribe the original puzzle in the language of the thought experiment or the philosophical theory. And step 2 is to use the thought experiment or philosophical theory to say what the answer is. So to clarify this, I'm just going to be going back to the two examples that I mentioned before. So in the example of the poultry slaughterhouse workers and Myers' thought experiment, here's what you might do. For the first step, you'll describe the example as a situation where an employer is arguing that they have not acted wrongly because they see that they are benefiting the worker through an offer to which the worker consents. In this example, the second step is going to be to explain how the thought experiment shows how the defense appealed to by the employer fails. In the example of the firm that wishes to lie to customers, the first step would be to describe the situation as one where the firm is considering using their customers merely as a means, rather than seeing humanity as an end in itself. And the second step would be to describe how Kantian theory says that such actions are prohibited. All right, so that's everything I have to say. Good luck.